In this lecture, we are going to meet Darwin and Wallis. I really like the story of both of these men. They have a great story. And one of the reasons that I like their story is because I think that they're super relatable people. So, for instance, our friend Chuck Darwin, who we last met when he was talking with his grandpa, Erasmus, and they were walking across the top of the mountains in Dover, and they were crunching um, over the seashells that were miles and miles away from the water, going, wonder when the last time the ocean was here. So Charles Darwin is part of um, the rich merchant class. So sometimes the merchant class has more money than the royals. And remember, Erasmus had been invited to be the physician to the king. So this is a family that has strong political and economic ties to its community. So Darwin gets of age, and by Darwin now, I'm just talking about Chuck. He gets of age and he goes to college, as he's supposed to do. And he is a shitty student. He is a terrible student. Oh, okay, so he's in England. So remember, I was just telling you guys that England has like this really dogmatic approach to religion and biology. So it isn't like he was getting a chance to study under Lamarck, right? If he'd been studying under Lamarck, maybe things would have turned out better for him. But he's supposed to be. So first he starts. I think he first started in law, and that lasted about 10 minutes. And then he's like, well, I like biology. I like living things. Let me try medicine. So, okay, you can only be in these days, you can really only be a few things from going to college. You can be a doctor, you can be a lawyer, or you can be clergy. And clearly this isn't a family heading for the clergy. So first he tries law, and that didn't work. And then he tries medicine. And he's like, no, you can't do it. He's like, when they had to dissect cadavers, Darwin's like, I didn't sign up for this. And he's ditching school to go to the ocean to get buckets of sea creatures. And he's rented this garage, and he is looking at sea creatures like under microscopes, and he's trying to figure out, like his grandpa did, how their breeding system works. And he's like wondering why the hell he can't learn this in school. I have to tell you, I don't know what's the obsession with studying sea creatures. Like, they're hard to study because we don't live in the sea. Aristotle did it too. I think it was Aristotle. Aristotle did it too. He's like pulling things out. He's like, once he was obsessed with sponges. Like, really, the minute you take a sponge out of the water, it is no longer interesting. Like, and so he's like trying to look underwater, but there's no scuba gear 2,000 years ago. That's or however, I guess it's longer than 2,000 years. Anyway, it's ridiculous. Come on, what's wrong with studying the bugs or the earthworms? Soil's good. I digress. Okay, so Darwin is skipping classes to go to get buckets of sea creatures and bring them to his rented closet, his rented garage to look at stuff. And he's failed out of one degree program, and he's in the other one, and he's well on his way to failing out of that one. And he is approached by a friend of his who is going to captain the HMS Beagle. And they are going to go all the way down to the bottom of South America. It's going to be gone 5 years. And the captain wants Darwin to come with because Chuck is almost royalty. And Chuck is educated and comes from an educated, well-connected family. And to be a captain of the ship at the time, you had to be royalty. And so the captain of the ship was looking at his roster of people who's going to be on board, and they're all working class. And he's like, oh my God, this is a snooze fest. I don't have anybody cultured to talk to. Hey, Chuck, will you come with me? It's a true story. And Chuck's like, well, what am I going to do? And the captain says, oh, you can be our ship's naturalist. And you can imagine. Like Charles Darwin is the man who's skipping school to go look at sea creatures, right? He's with, oh, I want to be the naturalist on HMS Beagle. Okay, but he can't just up and go, right? Because his dad's like sending him to college. So he goes home. He says, Dad, let me go on this ship. I want to go on this trip. And the dad's like, no, man, you can't just come finish school, get married, get a job. Come on, get your life on track, man. And Charles is like, no, I want to go. I want to see the big wide world. I want to see all the animals and the plants. And the dad's like, no. And finally, Charles is like, please. And the dad's like, oh, okay, listen, go talk to your uncle, my brother. If you can get my brother, your uncle, to say yes to this harebrained plan, I will say yes. So Charles gets on his horse, clip, 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 clop, 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 goes 2 miles away to the uncle's house and says, Uncle, help me talk some sense into my dad. I really want to go on this trip. And the uncle says, listen, here's what you do. You promise your dad that you're going to get married when you come back, and then he'll let you go. And Chuck is like, plan. So he goes back home. And of course, I mean, you know that Chuck went on the Beagle, so Dad said yes. And to be fair, Chuck did get married when he got back. So Darwin is on the Beagle, and he is a naturalist on the Beagle. He's a shitty naturalist, surprising absolutely no one. So I don't know. One of the anniversaries of Darwin's death or birth or discovery of the Galapagos or something like that, the museum that had been receiving all of his gear. Okay, I'm going to tell you 2 reasons why he was a terrible naturalist. Here's the first one. The museum who was receiving all of his gear said that they were cleaning out like their back rooms and their back closets and their storage areas, and they found crates and crates of stuff that Chuck had shipped from South America to England, and it was in storage in this museum. But the museum 200 years ago, and the museum now is like, we don't know what to do with this, because it was a crate of dead birds, which was what he was supposed to do, but not where they're from, not when he caught them. There's no identifying. They could have been from Argentina, or they could have been from Costa Rica. Nobody knows where they're from. Now we could guess, but he didn't even label his shit. And okay, that's problem number 1, labeling. Always label your sample. So really a good rule of thumb. And the other problem, this one's kind of funny too, is that the HMS Beagle, before Chuck ever stepped foot on it, had its own naturalist. And the naturalist was a state paid position. Came with a salary, came with a budget. You're allowed to spend, I don't know, $50 a week and mailing shit back. And Chuck blew through the budget. He didn't pay any attention to the budget. He's just like, and he's like doubling and tripling and sending whatever. He's not paying attention to the budget. He's not labeling his shit. And the state paid naturalist is like rolling his eyes. And after 3 months of this, he quits. He gets off the ship and he like walks home. He didn't walk home, but he took the next ship home. He's like, I did not sign up for this madness. I'm not responsible for this. So Chuck actually was such a bad naturalist, he made the actual naturalist quit. Okay, so let's talk for a minute about Alfred Wallace. So Alfred Wallace has a completely different kind of life story, but also an interesting life story. So Alfred and his brother were poor, and they're from Liverpool, and their parents were dead. They are not part of the ruling class. They're not part of the merchant class. They're not part of the royal class. They are working class stiffs who are orphans. Okay, and they're making their way in Liverpool as kids, and they turn their skills to taxidermy. True story. I keep saying that, but this stuff is all true. And so they turn their skills to taxidermy, and they taxidermy people's pets, all the birds. Anytime that somebody needs taxidermy, Alfred and his brother are on the case. Okay, as they're sifting through the alleys of Liverpool, looking for dead shit to taxidermy, they're finding all these National Geographic flyers. Just like now, National Geographic has been around a long time. They've been making magazines and flyers for a long time. And they used to host regular, probably still do, but they used to host these regular talks where everybody would come. And, if you were poor, you stood in the back. And if you were rich, you went to the front. But this is what people did for fun. They went to science talks. Oh, what have the National Geographic explorers found out? Wallace really, really, really fell in love with the Amazon, and he and his brothers set their hearts, their caps on going to the Amazon. They wanted to see the birds, they wanted to see the monkeys, they really, really wanted to go. So they set themselves up as the taxidermiest of the century. And so they get this gig where they go to the Amazon, finally go to the Amazon, and they're supposed to taxidermy whatever they can catch. Well, okay, imagine, imagine if you will. This is like they're as hapless as you or I would be. Imagine that somebody sends me to the Amazon and says, "Here, Sharon, go catch the birds and monkeys." Like, I look around the forest, go, "Huh? I know there are monkeys here because somebody took a picture, but I sure don't see any. How do you find them? How do you catch them? You think they're gonna like jump into your bag?" Like, no. So they finally get the guides because they're from Liverpool. What do they know about catching a parrot? Okay, so they finally catch their ship and they taxidermy it and they do a good job and they put it in these baskets and they're going to bring them home. And then disaster struck in the form of ants. Just right, you can't make this up. Ants ate all of their taxidermy samples, all of it. It's like termites going through eating the house in the cartoons. That's what the ants did to Wallace's taxidermied samples. Ate the whole goddamn thing. So they went home in disgrace. Actually true. Went home in disgrace. But Wallace was good enough. Oh God, sorry, it's late here. Wallace was a good enough, hard enough worker and good at things that he managed to get a job. You know what I was talking about in the last story with Darwin being the bane of the state paid naturalist. Well, Wallace was a state paid naturalist on his, and his ship had a better name than the Beagle. It was the Mischief. I mean, frankly, which would you rather be on, the Beagle or the Mischief? I think we would all pick the Mischief. If you're going to pick the Beagle instead, you're either Charlie Brown or you're doing it wrong. Okay, so Wallace goes out on the Mischief. Okay, I want to talk for a minute about taxidermy. Okay, so let's say that I give you your job is to taxidermy 100 starlings. Let's say that you know how to taxidermy, and you taxidermy 100 starlings. You're going to get really good at looking for variation. By the time you've done like starling number 10, you know where all the bones are. By the time you get to starling number 20, you know where all the bones should be. And by the time you get to starling number 1,000, if something's weird, you're going to notice. So it gives you this idea of variation, which turns out to be important. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so what I think we're on, I can't see this, step 6, whatever, you guys can see it, I can't see it. But whatever step this is, we're putting Wallace and we're putting Darwin on a ship. Okay, so Darwin's on the Beagle from 1831 to 1836. And Wallace is later, he's going from 1948 to 1952. Okay, so these guys are on the ship long enough to go look at some crazy shit. Okay, so I've got pictures of them here when they're young men, because I think we're used to thinking about them as like being so wise and hairy and serious, and they were idiots just like the rest of us. Okay, so I just want to remind you of ideas floating around at the time. And these ideas are important, just like for you, ideas floating around right now, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, pandemic. These ideas are floating around, you're internalizing them, they're shaping the way that you see the outside world. So these are the ideas that we're shaping their internal worlds. First, now this would have been particularly real for Charles because his grandpa was keen on this one. Fossils show a great geological time. All right, they suggest that the world is a lot older than 6,000 years. Okay, it might be heretical to think that and heretical to say it, but anybody who's got eyes and a brain can see that fossils are probably making the world older than 6,000 years. Okay, and then we get this idea from Malthus that more organisms are born than can possibly survive. And remember, the importance of this is that it suggests competition, right? Because if no matter what food source you're offering, there's never going to be enough, that means that there's going to be some sort of winnowing, some culling going on there. Okay, and then we get this idea from Lamarck. The environment affects the shape and organization of animals. So the physiology and behavior of animals is going to depend on how hot it is, how rainy it is, how mountainous it is. Environment matters. Thank you, Lamarck. And lastly, we have this idea that God made everything as we see it, that God made everything unchanging, that the world is perfect in the way that it is. And this is important, even though it's contradictory, it's important because it certainly influenced Darwin's behavior, and it probably slowed the evolution of the idea of evolution. Okay. Okay. So Alfred Wallis went to Sulawesi in Indonesia, which is important because it's an archipelago. It's a suite of islands. Darwin, of course, he went, around South America with a nice famous stop in Ecuador where he went to the Galapagos. Okay, aren't these pictures of these turtles super cute right here? Okay, wait, sorry. I want my pen. I'm clearly not checked out on this, right? Okay, these pictures right here of these tortoises. Okay, I'm not picking the pen that lasts forever, I don't think. Darwin drew those. Those are his own sketches. And the story of, everybody knows about Darwin and his finches, but that isn't where Darwin had his epiphany. Darwin had his epiphany over dinner with the governor of Ecuador, so eating turtle soup. True story. So it turns out that if you are educated and you're traveling from someplace like London or England and you're going to the backwaters of Ecuador back in the early 1800s, when you get to Ecuador, the governor is so happy to see you that he invites you to dinner. And not only does he invite you to dinner, it's an expensive, delicious dinner. And so Darwin and the captain, they go to dinner with the governor. And the governor is trying to brag a little bit. And the governor says, hey, I can tell you which island in that island chain right out my bedroom window here, the turtle came from in the soup you're eating if the cook brings me the shell. And Darwin's like, you can tell which island by looking at the shell? And the governor's like, yeah, I sure can. Darwin's like, really? And the governor's like, chef, bring me the shell. Chef brings out the shell and governor looks at it and is like, yep, it's from Island X. And Darwin's like, Darwin went and checked. Like, really? And sure enough, you could tell which island a tortoise came from by the shape of its shell. And that is what Darwin got Darwin's heart going, oh. Okay, and he wrote here on this slide, says, it is the circumstance that several of the islands possess their own species of the tortoise, and this strikes me with wonder. He was blown away by this. And the reason he was blown away by this is for the same reason that, the Victorians were blown away by the hand thing. And because all of these tortoises look like a tortoise, they're clearly a tortoise, but they are specialized to their island. So they obviously had one common ancestor that then speciated. Not that they had the word yet, speciated. I don't think, maybe they did in the book. Okay. One of the reasons that Darwin was able to see this effect is because islands have, those physiological barriers called oceans. And so there's some distance in between these islands. So the tortoise will get there and they'll be a little genetically isolated. And so they can specialize and they can come to suit their environment super well, which becomes more evident on islands than it does on a mainland. Okay, now let's talk about Wallis for a minute. Wallis has a really similar experience in Sulawesi. So the part of the world where Wallis was, it's got Indonesia. Okay, so there's a biogeographical barrier called the Wallis line, which is this thing you can't see with your eyeballs if you're on a boat, but it separates the water. It is it's an underground. I think it's a difference in ground layers underneath, but it causes the water on one side to all go that way and the water on this side to all go that way. And so you can't cross it very easily. And it's called the Wallis line. And the Wallis line is this water feature that you can't see, but you can't swim past. And there's a really funny National Geographic story about, a whole bunch of college kids trying to put together a canoe to get over the Wallis line, and they failed like 3 times. They did finally succeed. So, it's tricky to get over this Wallis line. So Wallis is on his HMS Mischief, and he's at the Wallis line where everything's going that way and everything's going that way. And on one side, you've got Indonesia, and the other side, you've got Australia. And he's looking around, and everything on the Australian side, like the birds, the bees, the plants, they all look Australian. And everything on the Sulawesi side, everything on the Indonesia side looks Indonesian. And so it became really clear that whatever the hell this Wallis line was doing, it was separating them and making things really different. And then Wallis went to all of these different islands. And the reason you can see him down here, my pen worked, I'm checked out, with a cockatoo is because he realized that on these different Indonesian islands, that cockatoos had variability that tracked the islands. Okay, so how are we gonna summarize what they said? We're gonna summarize it this way. What both men ended up observing is that species don't look like they were created independently. They don't look like they came from God's salt shaker. Instead, they look like they came from a similar species, that there was a cockatoo someplace, and it was the ancestral cockatoo that then speciated onto all of the islands. And the same for the tortoises. Okay, so both Darwin and Wallis had like this underlying question that they really wanted to know the answer to. And neither of them, like Darwin didn't learn it in school, and Wallis didn't learn it from like the newspapers he was reading. And what they were trying to explain is, why did organisms change over time? Because they were pretty clear at this point that creatures changed over time. Why did those tortoises change? And I have sort of skimmed over this idea. I'm not going to really focus on it, but they were focused on it. And they were like, how do you explain hooves? How do you explain shells? How do you explain beaks? They have a clear purpose. How do you get them? Where do they come from? Because remember, Lamarck gave us a very unsatisfactory answer, which is like, when you need them, you get them. It's not satisfactory. And so Wallis and Darwin were like, okay, let's see if we can't figure this out. Okay, and so here are the pictures of them as old men. They're serious and hairy, and they seem like they were never any fun, and they always had their shit together. They never did. Well, I do have to say this. Darwin did come home and he did marry, and he loved his wife. They had 10 kids. 2 of them died right off the bat. They spent their downtime playing backgammon. Darwin and his wife really loved playing backgammon. Darwin wrote The Origin of the Species, and he was talking about it with his friends, but he didn't want to publish. And he didn't want to publish for a couple of reasons. Um, Primarily, he was afraid. He was living at a time where the church had a very strong hold on intellectual thought, and he knew that it was going to be hard on his family, especially his wife, who he loved. Um, his wife actually is a person that you'd know. Not that you'd know her personally, but you might know her name. You know, Waterford Crystals. Um, it's a British crystal maker. If any of you have bought, maybe you guys are like, why would I buy crystal, Pochron? Fair enough. But if you ever did buy crystal, if you went to Bloomingdale's or Macy's, you could find Waterford Crystals and Waterford China, and that was her family. So it was these two strong mercantile families came together. And funny enough, some of Darwin's relatives are still scientists. His relatives, his great nephews and whatever, I don't remember how they're related, but they're physicists and chemists. I don't think we have any of them in biology, but it would be pretty cool to be Darwin's descendant working in biology. And he was right, because when he finally did get around to publishing his idea, he was in fact lambasted in the press. So Wallis went out to the field much later, like it was 12 years after Darwin. Wallis finished his book first, and he was getting ready to publish it. But now remember, Alfred was not part of the upper class in England. And when he got wind that Darwin had written something similar, instead of just rushing to publish, which is what I would have done, Wallis went and knocked on Darwin's door and said, "Hey, man, I'm going to publish this unless you want to publish it." And Darwin was like, Anyway, he published it. So they gave their first presentation together at the Linnean Society, and the culture at the time highly lambasted Darwin. He was right about that. Nobody in the elite class gave a shit that Wallis said the same thing. Darwin went on to write a book on sexual selection and one on earthworms. Yay, worms! And Wallis went on to study psychics. True story. Can't make this shit up. Well, first of all, before you mock him too much for studying psychics and spiritualists, as they were called at the time, in the United States, we had departments of psychics and spiritualism up until the 1990s. And I think the University of Pennsylvania and Duke had the last two programs in, I don't remember what they're called, paranormal or whatever, but the last two programs. And if you guys had to guess what those programs became, what would you guess? Did anybody guess psychology? That's what they became. Not religion. Most people guess religion, but they became the psych departments, because it turns out that most psychic phenomena and paranormal psychic phenomena are in your head. Not your head, maybe my head. So anyway, Wallis went on to study table knocking and ways to talk to the dead. And before you judge him too harshly, we're working at a time where people thought the veil between the living and the dead was a thin thing that you could, get between. And that you could communicate with the dead because it was just a veil. And this is coming at a time where remarkable achievements were happening, right? The agriculture industry is changing, the medical industry is changing, where new technologies are all the time. And these guys, Wallis and Darwin, at the forefront of new thoughts being applied in new ways, because they're giving us natural selection. Okay, so in their own words, what did Wallis and Darwin conclude? They concluded, these are their own words, and they're a little confusing, so let's talk about them. Any being, they mean creature, if it has a variation that gives it an advantage, will be naturally selected. Okay, so if you got a creature that's got something good for it, it's going to be the thing that outcompetes the other creature. It's going to be selected. Okay, Another way to talk about that is advantage variation will be selected within generations. There's a time element implied here that in the upcoming text, but really what they were trying to say is that given enough time, beneficial things get selected for. They said one more thing. From the strong principles of inheritance, any selected variety will tend to propagate its new and modified form. Okay, as long as there's a genetic component, something that's beneficial will tend to they'll tend to be more beneficial things in the upcoming generations. In other words, those advantages will be passed down to the next generation, changing the population. That's pretty cool. Okay, so surprising no one, Wallace and Darwin give us this idea of evolution by natural selection. Okay, that's what I got for you guys for this lecture, which was a little bit more than mini, but not quite long. See you guys later. There we go.